So, imagine for a second that you are a county clerk in Pennsylvania.
Well,
You know, you've spent your entire career running local elections. You know the state laws. You know your voting machines. You know your local postal workers. And then you wake up to a new federal mandate.
right, just completely out of the blue.
Exactly. You read through it and you slowly realize that if you mail out a ballot the exact same way you did, 2 years ago, you might actually be facing federal prison time.
I mean, it is a paralyzing realization for a local official. Just completely
It
paralyzing.
really is. But now, I want you to cut to a totally different scene. An auto body shop owner in Colorado is staring at an invoice for a crate of replacement parts.
Okay, quite the pivot.
Right. But he's doing the math, realizing he has to pass a sudden, $300 price hike onto a customer. And not because the parts got better, but because diplomatic trade talks with Canada broke down over the weekend.
Yeah, two entirely different scenarios, right? Separated by thousands of miles, totally different industries, but driven by the exact same mechanism.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are so thrilled to have you with us today because what connects that county clerk in Pennsylvania and that auto mechanic in Colorado is, well, it's the blistering speed of executive power.
It really is.
Our mission today is to unpack this massive, multifaceted stack of sources that you sent us. We are looking at a breaking Supreme Court decision regarding mail-in voting, dropping just 71 days before the 2026 midterms.
Which is an incredibly tight timeline.
Insanely tight, but simultaneously, we are looking at enormous global economic shockwaves. We're talking sanctions on China, a trade war with Canada, trillion-dollar bond market interventions, and all of it orchestrated by the exact same administration at the exact same time.
It is a study in what happens when the massive machinery of the federal government is pushed to move at a velocity that the system just wasn't originally designed to handle.
Before we really get our hands dirty here, I have to establish some ground rules for today's deep dive. We have a mandatory disclaimer on impartiality because, the source material you provided us is a fascinating but very volatile mix.
Yeah, you really gave us a wide spectrum here.
We've got highly technical legal breakdowns from Skeltu's blog. We have standard news reporting from NBC News. And we have highly charged, heavily polarized political commentary from left-wing sources, including excerpts from the YouTube channel Vouch and legal analysts on MSNBC.
And the temperature in some of these sources is, well, it's incredibly high. I mean, we're dealing with serious accusations of election interference on one side and claims of securing election integrity on the other.
So I am saying this directly to you, the listener. We are not here to take sides.
Right. Absolutely not.
We are not here to endorse any of these viewpoints or tell you what to think about the upcoming midterms or foreign policy. Our job is strictly to map out the factual information, explain the underlying mechanisms of how these things actually work, and, explore the intense arguments presented in your sources.
I just want to put the whole board in front of you so you can see all the pieces clearly. Because regardless of your political leanings, the mechanics of these decisions, they are going to impact you.
Exactly. Whether you are prepping to vote, running a business reliant on international supply chains, or just trying to navigate a media landscape that feels like a fire hose of information, this deep dive connects the highest courts and federal agencies directly to your daily life.
The decisions being made right now are dictating how your ballot is processed, how much you pay at the mechanic, and, frankly, the stability of the global markets tying into your retirement.
So let's jump in. To understand the Supreme Court ruling that is making headlines today, we have to rewind slightly, because we can't start at the Supreme Court.
No, we had to start at the White House.
Right. We have to start with the blueprint. So let's unpack this March 2026 executive order signed by President Trump. This is the document that sparked the entire legal firestorm.
It's the catalyst for everything we're talking about domestically today.
Broadly, it's aimed at citizenship verification and federal election integrity, heavily targeting mail-in voting. And looking at the breakdown from the SCOTUS and blog source, there are three primary provisions. I want us to go through them, but more importantly, I want us to understand how they actually work on a mechanical level.
Yeah, the logistics are where this gets really complicated.
So Provision 1 instructs the Department of Homeland Security, the DHS, to create lists of adult U.S. citizens for each state and send them out at least 60 days before a federal election.
Which, on paper, that sounds like a relatively simple data transfer. But you have to ask, How does the DHS actually generate a comprehensive, error-free list of every adult citizen in a specific state?
Because we don't have a national ID card. The United States doesn't have a centralized national citizen registry.
Exactly. We don't have that. So the DHS has to aggregate this data from various existing federal databases. They are pulling from Social Security Administration records, passport data from the State Department, and immigration and naturalization records from their own internal agencies like ICE and USCIS.
Oh, wow. So they are just cobbling it all together.
Right. They have to merge these massive, historically siloed databases, filter them by state residency, which, by the way, is constantly changing if people move, and then compile a definitive list.
And database merging is notoriously messy. I mean, I know from just trying to merge two email contact lists that you end up with duplicates, outdated addresses, people who got married and changed their names.
Oh, yeah. It's never clean.
If the DHS is doing this on a scale of hundreds of millions of people, the error rate has to be a massive factor.
It's a huge factor, which is why state voter rolls have historically been managed locally, where county clerks can verify a change of address or a death certificate directly. Shifting that to a macro-level federal database introduces entirely new logistical vulnerabilities.
Which brings us to Provision 2. This commands the U.S. Attorney General to prioritize prosecuting state and local officials who issue federal ballots to ineligible voters. Let's talk about the mechanism of a chilling effect here.
Yeah, this is a really important concept.
Because they don't actually have to lock up 1,000 county clerks to get what they want, do they?
Not at all. The mechanism of a chilling effect relies on ambiguity and really the asymmetry of power. You have to remember, a local election official makes, on average, a very modest public servant salary.
Right, they aren't exactly rolling in legal defense funds.
Exactly. They do not have the personal resources to fight a federal indictment. When the Attorney General announces that prosecuting these specific officials is a top priority, the calculus for that local official changes instantly.
How so? Like in a practical sense?
Well, if there is a slight discrepancy in a voter's registration, say, a hyphenated name that doesn't perfectly match the new DHS list the local official used to err on the side of the voter based on state guidelines.
But now erring on the side of the voter could mean the Department of Justice knocks on their door, so they pump the brakes.
They deny the ballot to protect themselves. Precisely. The policy relies on self-censorship and risk aversion at the lowest levels of the bureaucracy.
That is heavy. But Provision 3 is where the logistics get truly mind-bending to me. The states must give the U.S. Postal Service a list of intended mail ballot recipients. And the USPS is explicitly prohibited from mailing ballots to anyone not on a federally created, quote, enrolled list.
And that's just the start of it.
Right, because wrapped up in this are incredibly specific postal regulations. The envelopes must have an official election mail logo, they must be automation compatible, and they need unique barcodes with delivery point zip codes.
It's extremely technical.
Explain the logistics of this to me, because this sounds like an administrative nightmare masquerading as a clerical update.
Well, it is entirely about the physical machinery of the Postal Service.
Why?
Think about how a mail sorting facility operates. They have these massive, high-speed, optical character recognition machines.
Okay.
These machines pull envelopes through belts at astonishing speeds, reading barcodes to route them to the correct carrier's bin. Historically, many counties design their own ballot envelopes.
Like just standard local printing jobs.
Yeah. Some were odd sizes, some didn't have standardized barcodes, meaning they often had to be sorted by hand or processed through slower, non-standard machinery.
Which is slow, but it worked because it was localized. I mean, they were handling their own volume.
Right. But what this executive order demands is absolute uniformity so that ballots can be tracked and verified against the new federal list at machine speed.
Machine speed, okay.
And to be automation compatible means the paper weight, the envelope dimensions, the exact placement of the barcode, and even the reflectivity of the ink all have to meet strict federal tolerances.
Wait, so if a county in Wisconsin has like 2 million ballot envelopes already printed and sitting in a warehouse, but the barcode is half an inch too far to the left?
Or doesn't have this specific new federal logo, under this order, those envelopes are garbage.
You're kidding. Millions of envelopes.
The USPS is prohibited from delivering them.
Yeah.
The county would have to source new paper, redesign the envelopes, contract a specialized printer, and run quality assurance tests on USPS machines, all within weeks of an election.
That's impossible.
The supply chain for specialized envelope paper alone cannot accommodate thousands of counties suddenly needing to reprint millions of pieces of mail simultaneously.
Which perfectly illustrates the core constitutional tension we are dealing with here. I was trying to think of how to visualize this clash between state and federal power.
It's tricky to conceptualize.
It's a bit like, imagine you manage the inventory for a massive regional grocery store chain. You know exactly how your local supply lines work. You know your local vendors. That's the states running their elections, right?
Okay, I follow you.
Then corporate headquarters steps in 30 days before Thanksgiving and says, we've signed a new contract. Every single turkey must now be delivered in a specific, proprietary, federally branded cooler, verified by our own corporate inspectors at the loading dock, or we are firing you and shutting down the store.
That's a great analogy. It's an abrupt usurpation of localized processes. And the reason this creates a legal earthquake is because of Article 1, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution, the Elections Clause.
The Elections Clause.
Yeah. It dictates that the times, places, and manner of holding elections shall be prescribed in each state by the state legislature. The states have historically guarded the day-to-day administration of voting, registering voters, maintaining rolls, designing ballots as their sovereign territory.
Now, Congress can pass laws to alter regulations, but this isn't Congress doing this. This is the executive branch.
Correct. The executive branch is utilizing agencies under its direct control, Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and the Postal Service to essentially build a federal filter over the state's pipeline.
And so the states are arguing that this oversteps executive authority and illegally strips them of their constitutional mandate to run elections.
Exactly. And the states absolutely did not take this lying down. This triggers a massive legal chess match that moves at light speed from Boston all the way to Washington, D.C.
Right. So a coalition of 23 states, led by California, along with Washington, D.C., filed suit in a Massachusetts federal court.
And this lands in front of U.S. District Judge Indira Talwani. Her ruling is fascinating because she splits the baby in a very specific legal way.
Based on the timeline, right. According to the SCO2 flog source, Judge Talwani ruled that the state's claims about elections happening after November 2026 were not right.
Right. We were going to unpack that word in a second.
But she looked at the impending 2026 midterms, which were literally weeks away, and said this creates a direct and immediate dilemma. So she issued an injunction freezing the federal government from implementing these new postal and DHS rules for the upcoming election.
She essentially looked at the logistical reality of those automation-compatible envelopes and the DHS database merges we just talked about, and recognized that forcing this system change right now would cause the machinery of the election to seize up entirely.
But the administration immediately appeals. The First Circuit Court of Appeals refuses to pause her injunction, so the Trump administration takes it straight to the Supreme Court.
The final stop.
The government's argument is delivered by Solicitor General D. John Sauer. And this is where we have to translate some heavy legal jargon, because Sauer leans on two massive concepts: ripeness and irreparable harm.
Two very heavy hitters in constitutional law.
Let's start with ripeness. What is it, and how does Sauer use it?
Well, ripeness is a foundational concept stemming from Article 3 of the Constitution, which restricts federal courts to only hearing actual active cases or controversies.
Meaning they don't deal in hypothetical scenarios.
Exactly. Courts are not advisory boards. They don't weigh in on hypothetical situations or draft policies. A case is only ripe when a policy has been finalized and someone has actually been harmed by it.
So Sauer is arguing that because the executive order just tells the Postal Service and DHS to start figuring out how to do this, the rules aren't technically final yet.
Right. He is arguing that the states are suing over a phantom. Until the USPS publishes the final binding rule in the Federal Register outlining the exact barcode specifications and list-checking procedures, the states haven't actually suffered a legal injury.
And therefore,
the court has no jurisdiction to hear the case. It's simply too early.
okay, I have to push back on this logic, because I am trying to put myself in the shoes of that county clerk again. How can something be too early to sue over if the election is 71 days away and I have to send ballots to the printer tomorrow?
It's incredibly frustrating for the states.
It's like a referee watching a hockey player wind up his stick, aiming right for another player's head. The stick is an inch away, but the referee refuses to blow the whistle on a flagrant foul because the wood hasn't technically made contact with the helmet yet. The damage is a guaranteed physical reality based on the trajectory.
Your hockey analogy perfectly captures the frustration of the states there. But the federal government counters this by deploying the second legal concept: irreparable harm.
Okay, let's break that down.
To get an emergency injunction from the Supreme Court, you have to prove that if the court rules against you, you will suffer a catastrophic loss that no future court victory or financial payout can ever fix.
And how does the federal government claim they are the ones facing irreparable harm here? I mean, they are the ones changing the rules.
Sauer argued that if Judge Talwani's injunction stays in place, the federal government is blocked from securing the 2026 midterms. Since you cannot rerun an election, preventing the government from implementing these security measures right now constitutes an irreparable harm to the sovereign interests of the United States.
Wow. So the states are screaming, if you don't stop this, our elections will collapse because we can't print the envelopes in time. And the federal government is screaming, if you do stop this, the election will be unsecure and we can never get that time back.
Both sides are completely weaponizing the calendar.
And the calendar is ticking down, which brings us right to the breaking 10-page ruling that just dropped from the Supreme Court.
This is where the legal theory meets reality.
It's a 10-page, unsigned ruling, a per curiam opinion. I want to pause on that term because I see this in the news all the time. What does it actually mean when a Supreme Court opinion is unsigned?
Well, a per curiam opinion literally translates to by the court. It means the decision is issued in the name of the court rather than specific judges.
So nobody claims authorship. Why do that?
Historically, it was used for routine, non-controversial administrative matters where the law was totally settled. However, in recent years, the Supreme Court has increasingly used per curiam opinions on the shadow docket.
Ah, the shadow docket.
Yeah, these are emergency appeals handled incredibly quickly, often without full oral arguments. When it's used in highly controversial cases like this, it often signals that the majority wants to present a unified institutional front, or, that the decision was drafted so quickly among the majority justices that no single author took the lead.
It really adds to the feeling of how fast all of this is moving. So let's break down the majority's logic. They granted the government's request, they lifted the injunction, the federal government is cleared to proceed.
Right, and the majority went through the executive order piece by piece.
Yeah. For Provision 1, the DHS list, they said this is just an internal directive from the president to an agency. It doesn't legally compel the states to do anything, so the states lack standing.
Standing is sort of the sibling to ripeness. If ripeness asks, is it the right time to sue? Standing asks, are you the right person to sue?
Okay, that makes sense.
The court is saying that because the DHS list is just a piece of paper handed to the states haven't suffered a concrete injury just by receiving it.
But the states are arguing that Provision 3 forces them to use that list via the post office.
And that is exactly where the majority applies the ripeness doctrine we just discussed. For Provision 3, the majority agreed with Solicitor General Sauer. They ruled that the USPS provision simply initiates a rulemaking process.
So because it's just initiating the process, they can't sue.
Since the rule isn't final, the states can't sue. They literally wrote that if a final rule eventually harms the states, they can challenge it then.
Challenge it then. When is then? 12 hours before polls open.
That's a very fair question.
Which brings us to the dissents, because the 3 Democratic appointees were furious about this exact logic. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson wrote a 23-page dissent. She accused the majority of taking its eye off the ball, saying they missed the government's actual objective, which she flatly called an effort to, quote, foment chaos ahead of the elections.
And, when a Supreme Court justice uses a phrase like foment chaos, you have to look at the administrative reality she's describing.
What does she mean by that?
She is arguing that the executive branch isn't actually trying to build a functional voter verification system. They are deliberately weaponizing the bureaucracy to create a logistical bottleneck that they know the states simply cannot survive.
And Justice Sonia Sotomayor, joined by Justice Elena Kagan, wrote a separate dissent that went straight after the government's hypocrisy regarding the calendar.
They did not hold back.
She pointed out that the government is essentially saying it's too early for the states to sue because the rule isn't final, but it's too late for the government to wait because the election is right now.
It is a profound logical contradiction. And this introduces a concept well known to election lawyers, the Purcell principle.
Okay, what is that?
Established in a 2006 case, the Purcell principle dictates that federal courts should generally not change election rules right before an election, because doing so confuses voters and election officials.
So it's basically the hands-off, it's too close rule.
Right. Historically, plaintiffs sue, and the Supreme Court says, you sued too late, the election is in 2 months, we can't change the rules now.
But here, the timeline is completely flipped.
Exactly. In this case, the states sued months ago. And the Supreme Court is now telling them, you sued too early because the administrative rules aren't technically final yet.
Wow, so if you sue early, it's not ripe. If you sue late, it violates the Purcell principle.
Yes. Justice Jackson is highlighting this catch-22, pointing out that this framework allows the executive branch to completely game the judicial system. They can intentionally slow-walk the finalization of a rule until it is practically election day, making it entirely immune to legal challenge from both sides of the timeline.
I want to clarify something absolutely crucial for the listener here. Based on what you just said, the Supreme Court didn't actually say the executive order was constitutional, right? They didn't rule that the president legally possesses the power to federalize voter rolls.
That is exactly right, and it's a huge point. The majority opinion entirely punted on the underlying constitutional question. They did not say the president's actions were legal. They simply said the states chose the wrong procedural moment to ask the question.
And while lawyers debate the esoteric timing of Article 3's standing, the political realm operates on immediate, on-the-ground reality. Which brings us to the partisan shockwaves. The clock says midterms are 71 days away. Let's look at how this ruling is landing in the political trenches.
And this is where we need to remember our disclaimer. We are analyzing the intense reactions in the source material, not adopting them as our own.
Absolutely. Looking at the left-wing perspective, specifically the commentary from the YouTuber Vaush and the legal analysts on MSNBC like Ian Bassin and Lisa Rubin, there is severe alarm.
They are viewing this as a worst-case scenario.
They are framing this not as a clumsy administrative rollout, but as a calculated, unconstitutional effort to steal the midterms. Let's dig into the specific mechanisms they fear. Lisa Rubin raised the alarm about the DHS lists. She pointed out that the agencies compiling these lists include ICE. She fears this will generate thousands of false positives.
Which is a very real technical concern.
Explain to me how a false positive actually happens in a database merge and what it means for a voter.
Well, database mismatches happen primarily due to inconsistent data entry over time. Let's say a woman named Mary Smith Jones registered to vote locally under her hyphenated married name, but a Social Security record only has her maiden name Smith.
All right, that happens all the time.
Or let's say someone became a naturalized citizen last year, so they are legally eligible to vote, but the DHS uses an older, cached version of a DMV database that still lists them as a non-citizen resident.
Oh, I see.
When the federal algorithm cross-references these lists, it flags them as an anomaly. The fear is that the DHS will hand these lists of anomalies to the states and say, do not let these people vote.
Wow, so thousands of legitimate, legally eligible citizens show up to their polling place only to find they've been purged from the rolls without their knowledge.
Exactly. A bureaucratic typo that strips you of your constitutional right.
The second fear they highlight revolves around the Postal Service. The sources remind us that the USPS is run by a postmaster general appointed by President Trump. Vaush argues that the USPS could deliberately fail to send ballots to Democratic-leaning zip codes, using the new hyper-complex barcode requirements as a convenient excuse.
How would that work in practice?
Well, he's suggesting they could say, oh, the barcode was slightly smudged on the ballots from Philadelphia, so our machines rejected them. It's a compliance issue, not a political one.
It is a theory that assumes maximum bad faith and the total weaponization of the civil service.
But I want to challenge this narrative of a perfectly executed malicious conspiracy. I want to push back a little here. Do we really have evidence that this chaos is a coordinated, deliberate strategy?
That's a fair question.
Isn't it equally, if not more, possible that this is just spectacular bureaucratic incompetence? I mean, trying to implement a nationwide system in 11 days. You don't need malice to cause a disaster here. You just need a bad timeline. Can a bureaucracy even move this fast intentionally?
That is an excellent counterpoint. The federal bureaucracy is famously slow, lumbering, and resistant to sudden changes. To assume they could perfectly orchestrate the disenfranchisement of specific zip codes via barcode tolerances in a matter of weeks. I mean, that gives them a lot of credit for operational efficiency.
Right.
It is entirely plausible that the administration issued this order purely for political messaging to look tough on election security without fully grasping the logistical impossibility of what they were demanding from their own agencies.
The classic gap between the speechwriter and the engineer.
Exactly. But we have to look at the result. Whether it is deliberate malice or profound incompetence, the outcome on the ground is the exact same. Paralysis. NBC's Justice reporter Ryan Riley noted the administration's broader push to nationalize state-level issues. When you mandate the impossible and threaten federal prosecution for failure, you don't need the system to work perfectly to achieve your goal. You just need the system to freeze.
Going back to that clerk, if that county clerk in Pennsylvania realizes they can't possibly meet the new USPS barcode standards in 11 days, their safest legal option is to simply suspend mail-in voting entirely.
Right. The system breaks under the weight of the conflicting mandates.
Which brings us to the most jarring transition in this entire stack of sources. Because you would think an administration fighting a monumental, system-breaking legal battle over domestic elections would be entirely focused on that.
You would think so.
But the sources reveal they are simultaneously pulling massive, aggressive levers in the global economy and foreign policy space.
This is where we see the philosophy of rapid, forceful executive action applied not just to domestic voting, but to the international stage.
So let's transition to the geopolitical backdrop detailed by NBC News. And I want to connect these themes because it's not just that these things are happening at the same time. It's that they are being executed with the exact same aggressive, unilateral playbook. Let's look at Iran.
Okay, let's dive into it.
The sources state the war with Iran is approaching the 6-month mark, and the White House has initiated an economic D-Day, slapping sanctions on 60 foreign entities. But it's not just Iran they are targeting.
No, they are casting a much wider net.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is threatening to cut off Iran's trading partners, specifically warning Chinese banks. The sources note that before the war, 90% of Iran's oil was sold to China.
Explain the mechanism here. How does the U.S. Treasury Secretary threaten a bank in Beijing? What is a secondary sanction?
This is a crucial concept to understand because it is the ultimate weaponization of the U.S. dollar. A primary sanction is when the U.S. says American companies cannot do business with Iran.
Right, that's pretty standard. But a secondary sanction goes much, much further. The U.S. tells a foreign entity, in this case, a massive Chinese bank, you have a choice. You can either do business with Iran or you can do business with the United States financial system, but you cannot do both.
And because the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, that's a massive threat, right?
It is an existential threat. If a Chinese bank wants to process a major international transaction, it almost certainly has to move through the SWIFT system and eventually clear through a correspondent account at a U.S. bank in New York.
So if the Treasury Department cuts them off?
If the Treasury Department cuts off a Chinese bank from the U.S. financial system via secondary sanctions, that bank is effectively exiled from the global economy. They can't process international trades. They can't clear dollar transactions.
So they are essentially telling China to stop buying Iranian oil, or...
Or we will completely lobotomize your major banks financially.
Yeah. Wow. It is economic brinkmanship of the highest order. Because if you actually pull that trigger and sanction a major Chinese financial institution, you risk massive retaliation from the world's second largest economy.
An economy that is deeply intertwined with our own supply chains.
And speaking of supply chains and trade wars, while they are threatening China over Iran, the exact same administration is launching a brand new trade war with one of our closest allies, Canada.
It's dizzying how fast this is all happening.
And this is where the speed of executive action hits the listener's wallet directly. The NBC sources report that trade talks broke down, and instantly the president levied massive 50% tariffs on 5% of Canadian exports.
Just overnight.
Let's break down the mechanics of a tariff, because I think there's a huge misconception about who actually pays for this. Does the Canadian government write a check to the U.S. Treasury?
No, absolutely not. That is a very common misconception. A tariff is a tax levied on the importer.
Okay, so the American side...
Let's use the auto body shop in Colorado, mentioned in your sources. If that shop orders a crate of specialized auto parts manufactured in Ontario, Canada, the Canadian manufacturer doesn't pay the tariff.
Right.
When those parts cross the border, the American company importing them, or the logistics company handling the freight, has to pay a 50% tax to U.S. Customs before the goods are released.
So the cost of the parts just jumped by 50% for the American business.
Precisely. And that business owner has only two choices. Absorb the loss, which ruins their profit margin, or pass that $300 price hike directly onto the American consumer getting their bumper fixed.
Right, the customer just eats it.
Tariffs are fundamentally a tax on domestic consumption, designed to make foreign goods artificially more expensive so consumers buy domestic alternatives.
But the products listed in the sources, plywood, ice skates, auto parts, you can't just suddenly spin up an entire domestic supply chain for specialized auto parts overnight.
Exactly. It takes years to build those factories.
Right.
So in the short term, the consumer just eats the cost.
And Canada immediately retaliated. A Canadian official threatened to cut off electricity exports to the U.S., literally telling reporters, better have a pack of batteries.
Which is wild rhetoric
Yeah.
between two countries that share the longest demilitarized border in the world.
It really is. And we see the immediate bizarre ripple effects of this supply chain disruption. The sources mention an international airport in Buffalo, New York, actually running out of airplane fuel and scrambling to source it. How does a Canadian trade dispute ground airplanes in New York?
It highlights the invisible fragility of just-in-time logistics. Western New York, geographically, is deeply integrated into the Canadian energy grid and pipeline network.
Okay.
Jet fuel isn't stored in massive year-long reserves at local airports.
Yeah.
It is piped in or trucked in continuously. If trade halts at the border, whether through retaliatory embargoes or simply massive administrative delays caused by new customs checks for the tariffs, that pipeline flow is interrupted.
Just a total bottleneck.
Right. Within days, an international transit hub simply runs dry.
It's the butterfly effect. A signature on a tariff document in Washington grounds a commercial flight in Buffalo 3 days later. But I have to say, the most staggering financial maneuver in the sources is happening in the bond market.
Yeah, this one is truly unprecedented.
There are reports that Treasury Secretary Besant is planning to deploy up to $1 trillion from discretionary spending to manipulate the bond market. I need you to explain this like I'm five, but without losing the technical gravity of it.
I will do my best.
What is the bond market? How do yields work? And how does $1 trillion manipulate it?
Okay, let's break this down mechanically. The bond market is essentially where the U.S. government goes to borrow money. When the government spends more than it collects in taxes, it issues treasury bonds.
So they are selling debt.
Yes. Investors, which include foreign nations, pension funds, and individuals, buy these bonds, and the government promises to pay them back with interest over time. That interest rate is what we call the yield.
Got it. It's a massive loan, and the yield is the interest.
Right. And the yield, the interest rate the government has to pay, is determined by the open market, based on supply and demand. If investors are nervous about inflation or government debt, they demand a higher yield to take on the risk of buying the bond.
Makes sense.
Now, historically, the executive branch doesn't manipulate this directly. The independent Federal Reserve influences rates through monetary policy.
So what is the Treasury Secretary doing differently here? Why is this so controversial?
The report suggests the Treasury Secretary is taking $1 trillion of discretionary spending money appropriated by Congress, but largely under executive control, and using it to aggressively buy back or manipulate specific Treasury bonds in the open market.
To what end?
By introducing $1 trillion of artificial demand, he is attempting to manually force the bond yields down.
It's like a central bank flying an engine with oil to force it to run hotter and faster than it naturally wants to.
That is a very apt analogy.
Yep.
The mechanism is brute force. And the reason this matters to the listener is that U.S. Treasury yields are the bedrock of the entire global financial system.
It affects everything, doesn't it?
Everything. The interest rate on your 30-year fixed mortgage, the interest rate on your credit card, corporate borrowing rates, they are all pegged to the bond market. If the executive branch unilaterally deploys $1 trillion to artificially manipulate those yields, it creates massive, unpredictable distortions in inflation and consumer borrowing costs.
When you lay it all out like that, it takes my breath away. We've spent the last hour dissecting the logistics of election envelopes, the legal definitions of ripeness, the mechanics of secondary sanctions on Chinese banks, the reality of Canadian tariffs hitting auto shops, and the brute force manipulation of the bond market.
A lot to process.
Synthesize this for us. What is the underlying theme connecting all of these actions?
The unifying thread across every single source you provided is a specific, aggressive philosophy of governance, the centralization and acceleration of executive power.
Because normally things don't happen this fast.
Right. Traditionally, American systems rely on decentralized friction. States manage their own elections to distribute power. The independent Federal Reserve manages the bond market to separate politics from finance. Diplomacy and proportional responses manage trade to avoid economic shocks.
But the current approach bypasses all of that friction.
Precisely. Whether it is attempting to federalize state voting rolls through DHS, threatening global superpowers with secondary sanctions to isolate Iran, slapping 50% tariffs on close allies, or moving $1 trillion to manually shape domestic interest rates, the mechanism is the exact same.
Just bypassing the usual channels.
It is the executive branch attempting to pull the levers of power directly, unilaterally, and at maximum velocity, entirely disregarding historical norms or the logistical chaos it causes downstream.
And that chaos is exactly what the listener is feeling in their daily life. This is an abstract Washington theory. When the executive branch bypasses the traditional diplomatic friction and uses a tariff as a weapon, the immediate result is that $300 upcharge on your car repair.
It hits your wallet instantly.
When they aggressively manipulate the bond market, it dictates the interest rate you pay to buy a house. And when they issue impossible mandates to the Postal Service 71 days before an election, it dictates whether your ballot is ever counted.
The speed of the executive branch is actively colliding with the daily reality of the American citizen.
Which brings us to the end of our map. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started with the intricate, highly technical Supreme Court battle over mail-in voting rules and the Purcell principle.
And we unpacked the fierce partisan shockwaves and the logistical impossibility of 11-day implementation window for the USPS.
And we zoomed out to explore the exact same aggressive executive tactics being deployed in an economic D-Day against Iran, a trade war with Canada, and unprecedented bond market interventions.
It is, without a doubt, a profound stress test of the American administrative state.
It truly is. And to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you digest this massive deep dive. We spent a lot of time today discussing the legal concept of rightness and how the Supreme Court requires a rule to be final before they will intervene.
Right, the 18th century framework of judicial review.
Right. But we also spent an hour looking at how the modern executive branch can levy tariffs, manipulate global markets, and fundamentally alter election logistics overnight with the stroke of a pen. So the question we leave you with is this. Is our current legal framework built on slow, deliberate concepts of standing and ripeness fundamentally incompatible with the lightning-fast reality of modern administrative governance?
That's the big question.
If the executive branch can move markets and freeze election systems in a matter of days, can a judicial system designed for the horse and buggy era actually provide meaningful checks and balances before the damage is completely irreparable?
That is the defining question of modern constitutional law.
And it's one that will affect every single one of us. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly dense, complex journey today. We know it's a massive amount of information to process, but unpacking these mechanisms is exactly why we do this. As you go about your week, whether you're mailing a letter or checking your retirement account, look for the mechanisms beneath the headlines. Until next time, keep asking questions and stay curious.